Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the class is Comparative Human Behavior Theory. Class, you know the drill. Say hi to future viewing audiences.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi.
Today we're going to be talking about several different things. We're going to be talking about the following. We'll be talking about paths from Freud. I think we talked about Freud last time. Let me start with this. Think back to what we said last time. What are some of the Freudian concepts that seem to make intuitive sense to all of us? None?
The unconscious, to me, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, we know that we have an unconscious. Anybody else? Yeah.
That people grow and develop over their lifespan. They don't stay the same.
That there is growth and development. He didn't say over the lifespan. His growth and development only took you from birth until what age, more or less?
12 or 15.
Adolescence. So yes, there's growth and development that we could see in children. We can't necessarily see the kind of psychological development that he talked about, or personality development, but we can certainly see the people grow and develop.
That an infant feels like oneness with a mother.
Okay, that wasn't really part of Freud's theory, but the fact that infants cannot self-other differentiate is something that makes sense. Whether that happens or not empirically is another question. Yeah, Anna.
The defense mechanisms?
Yes, defense mechanisms. Not necessarily repression, but some of the others. And we didn't talk about the whole list. They're in your textbook. We know that we use defense mechanisms for self-esteem. Yes? Anything else that makes sense? That's it? Or because I'm not crazy about Freudian theory doesn't mean that you don't have to be. Nobody else is going to make an argument for things about Freud that make sense? The superego makes a lot of sense, folks. Not necessarily the processes, the internal processes, but the timing of some of the developmental tasks that he talked about certainly make a lot of sense. Did I see another hand up? Yeah, Ashley.
Talked about anxiety and it being and anxiety being a major part of the libido. I think.
Actually, does anybody remember what the two concepts were? Anxiety arises out of processes, but those are not Freud's two main processes. Remember what they were? Sex and aggression. And we're going to be talking about anxiety today, but some of the theorists that followed after him took a closer look at the role of anxiety in the infant. We're not talking about adults' anxiety, but rather infants' anxiety and how that manifests itself in later years. I want to give you a concept here that's really important to understand when we're looking at all of these developmental theories. All of these theories take adult concepts, because these are adults writing the theories, right? They take concepts that we think of as adults, and we then apply this to infants. We apply our adult concepts to infants, to children, et cetera, et cetera. You're following that? And many people have criticized these theories because as adults, do you remember what we said last week about how we lose memories of infancy? And we're going to be talking about this more in future lectures. Infants, roughly from the age birth to 1.5, 2, do not have memory for events necessarily that they can represent symbolically. And therefore, when we take a look at the deep unconscious or the not deep unconscious or what we think is going on in infants' brains, what we are doing essentially is, since we cannot experience as an adult what it is like to be an infant. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
When we have memories of things that happened in our childhood, we talked about this in a class session last week, we know that kind of memory doesn't really occur until 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember I asked you last week in our separate session to tell me about the earliest memory you have? And most people were right about 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. So that means as adults, we cannot get inside the infant's brain. So what are we doing when we put adult concepts onto infant development? It's called adult morphizing. Adult morphizing. That make sense to you? So we're using adult concepts that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of the infant, that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of children. Children are a little bit easier because we could talk to them and ask them about what they're thinking, what they're doing, how they're feeling, but we certainly can't get that information from infants. Okay, so what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be taking a look at all of the different roads from Freud, and I'm going to give you the nickel version of these. They're in your textbook, so you're going to have to read them on your own. But I really want you to see how pervasive Freudian thought is in our society, in societies in general, not all societies, but particularly in Western societies, and how we have come to incorporate so much of Freudian thought, whether we know it or not, into our everyday lives. Into our everyday lives, and we don't even think about it as stemming from Freud. This applies not only to theorists who are talking about early childhood development, but also theorists who are talking about midlife development and older age development. They are all based on either Freudian thought or one of the neo-Freudian reformulators. And again, I think we take this for granted, that some of the things that we know and believe, for example, about middle age, some of the things that we know and believe about old age, and we know them as quote-unquote fact, actually are more theoretically based. So let's take a look at the vast influence of Freud before we go on to talk about Erik Erikson, who's the main topic today. And we're going to see how Erikson's theory, while he added to it and while he was in fact a Freudian revisionist, and we're going to talk about ego psychology, he was an ego psychologist, what we're going to see is how well accepted this one version of lifespan development has become, and how this has influenced many other theoretical thinkers. So we're going to be looking at neo-Freudians, we're going to be looking at Erikson, we're going to be looking at offshoots from his work that then later show themselves in stage theories of midlife development, female development, and also in older adult development. So again, I want you to just keep in mind that all of these are progressive theories that build on each other, revise each other, but where do they all stem back to? Freud. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint. Some of the most common reformulations that are based on Freudian thought: Harry Stack Sullivan, who we'll talk about briefly today, and interpersonal psychoanalysis. Interpersonal psychoanalysis. That tells you he was still a Freudian psychoanalyst, but he's reformulated some of the ideas that Freud had. The entire field of ego psychology, which actually has two strains of thought that we'll talk about. Object relations theory. A theory that, if I would have to say, if there's any one theory that is most predominantly used today, even though it's not used very predominantly, but other theories that are used, it is probably object relations theory and sometimes self-psychology, both of which are offshoots of Freudian thought. Okay, that's what we find in the field of psychology. We also find another branch of thought, and this is what I mean by psychology. This is mainstream psychology. Theories about how people grow, how people develop. You following that? Okay, on the other side of this equation, we have something called the Freudian left. And of the Freudian left, there are two branches. There are the Marxist Freudians, and there are the Freudian Marxists, and we'll discuss those very briefly. Okay, let's start with interpersonal psychoanalysis. Harry Stack Sullivan. And the reason that I'm covering him even in this much detail is because you're going to see how much of his thinking really was then picked up by Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson was not the first theorist to talk about lifespan development, even though we tend to attribute that to him. Harry Stack Sullivan was a neo-Freudian and a psychoanalyst, and he retained many of the core concepts of Freud. And here's where we go. Ashley, did you mention anxiety before? Anxiety, and we're going to see this concept of anxiety pop up over and over again in many of the neo-Freudian formulations. What Harry Stack Sullivan said is that basic anxiety, which is part of what steers behavior, a significant force that steers behavior, doesn't result from the id-ego conflict. Let's think about that. What Freud said is that it's a conflict between the give me, I want it now, id, and the ego that says, wait a minute, there's reality out here. And that can give rise to anxiety. Instead, Sullivan said that anxiety results from social interactions. And he didn't limit it, as Freud did, to just mom. Well, actually, Freud didn't limit it to mom, but it was heavily focused on early childhood experiences with mom. Very importantly, what Sullivan did is that he focused on the interactional, how people interact with the child, and how that affects the child in terms of enduring personality traits and enduring ways of thinking. So he's not focusing on the intrapsychic. In other words, it's not that black box that we can't see, but rather interpersonal relationships that we can observe. And very importantly, in his work, he talked about what he called developmental epochs. They are very similar to developmental stages. And the important concept that he brought us here, even prior to Erikson, is that personality develops, in other words, personality development does not stop in late teenage years or early 20s, but rather personality tends to develop throughout the lifespan. Okay, from ego psychology. And remember, Erikson, who we're going to be talking about today, is an ego psychologist. We actually have, and you're going to see this in the development of theories, we actually have two different streams of thought. One is really classical Freudian theory, and it really emphasizes the unconscious, instinctual urges, and as you will see, anxiety again. And these are the forces that give rise to personality in this set of ego theorists. The other stresses the adaptive capacity of the ego and minimizes the deep unconscious. So do you understand? Let's start with this. Do you understand conceptually what we're talking about here? Yes? Conceptually, one school of Freudian thought went in one direction and the other went in another direction. Very important concept in ego psychology, the conflict-free ego sphere. The conflict-free ego sphere. Let's go over to the tablet for a minute. If you remember the diagram that I drew last time, everybody? According to the Freudian formulation, the ego, which is right there, in an infant grows out of the id. And therefore, so this is the deep unconscious, this is partly conscious, partly unconscious, and very small level of consciousness. The revisionists, you can come back to me now. The revisionists who were leaning more towards ego psychology, and I know that this sounds silly, it sounds very minute, but at the time this was a big brouhaha in psychoanalysis, because there were a group of theorists who were disagreeing with Freud and said, the ego does not grow out of the id. The ego, in fact, has a conflict-free sphere. I see blank looks on your face. Why is that important? Any ideas? Why is this reformulation going to... Let me ask another question. Why would this reformulation be so contentious? Yeah.
Because a lot of Freud's theory were based on that there is a conflict between your ego and the id.
Yes, because this was a major departure from what Freud was saying. And Freud depended on what I'm going to call a band of loyalists to further his theory. And therefore, anybody who disagreed with Freud was somebody who had left the camp, so to speak. And so here, does that make sense to you now? Mm-hmm. So what Freud was saying, you have to accept his theory in toto. You can't just take parts of it, and therefore, if he says that the main forces that drive human development, personality development, and psychopathology have to do with the conflict between the ego and the id, you cannot have a conflict-free ego sphere. So those who decided they were going in that direction were seen as deserters from his camp of thought. And I know that this might sound minute and silly to us now, but this caused a big brouhaha within the psychoanalytic community. Back to the PowerPoint. One outgrowth of Freudian thought is object relations theory. And this is essentially a derivation of both Freudian theory and ego psychology. So do you see how these theories get formulated and reformulated, borrowing bits and pieces from each? Object relations theory, quick summary, focuses on the process by which infants store and internalize images of objects that satisfy their drives. Sounds just like Freud, right? Yes, no? Yes. Anybody? Does it sound like, what did Freud say? Let's start with that. What did Freud say? That the infant stores images, and do you remember what we call that? Cathecting. That the infant cathects on the objects, images of the objects that give the infant pleasure. In object relations theory, again, this is a very complex theory, and this is the 2-cent version, not even the nickel version. I just want you to understand the conceptual differences. These objects are generally persons, and the main concern of object relations theories are the impact on personality that this has on interpersonal relationships, not just as an infant, but later in life. So they're really concerned about how this process affects interpersonal relationships. Another outgrowth of Freudian theory is self-psychology. Now here we see it's a reformulation of Freudian theory, ego psychology, and object relations theory. Are you starting to get a sense about how these theories grow and develop? And this set of theorists has taken some basic Freudian principles, added to that some basic ego psychology principles, and added to that some of the principles of object relations. However, in contrast to the other theories that are looking mostly at pathology, and we've got to really keep that in mind. I don't care whether you're talking about Freud or most of his followers, including Erikson in his early work, they were looking at pathology. They were trying to describe why people became neurotic, why people became mentally ill. They developed very grand theories of schizophrenia, of anxiety, of various neuroses, of personality disorders. Self-psychology is slightly different because they portray the human condition as being mostly psychologically healthy and characterized by that kind of healthy interdependence. So again, it's a different group of reformulators. In the other camp, not out of mainstream psychology necessarily, are the Freudian left. These are folks who were not viewed as mainstream, they were viewed as radical. Because what were they trying to do? They either rejected Freud's concepts entirely, or, well, they rejected Freud's central concepts, but not all of them, and therefore they ended up reformulating them while rejecting a great deal of what Freud said. Or some of the others tried to form a synthesis between the works of Freud and Karl Marx. Now let's think about this for a second. Back over to me. Karl Marx is the granddaddy of what theory? Everybody should have the answers to this. Conflict theory. His conflict was between what?
The bourgeoisie and
social classes. Yes? Are we awake today? No, we're not awake today. Okay. It's kind of dreary and it's going to rain. But you folks should know this stuff. Let's go back to Marxian theory. His was a conflict theory, right? The granddaddy, so to speak, of conflict theories. He was not looking at internal conflict. He was looking at conflict between groups in society. And specifically, he was looking at social class conflict. Now, let's turn over to Freudian theory. Freudian theory is also a conflict theory, but the conflict is placed elsewhere. The conflict in Freudian theory, where is it?
The self.
The what parts of the self?
The two instincts, the id and the ego competing, or the two drives also.
Okay, we have drives that are...
And the sexual.
Okay, here, rather than having economic forces that drive us, we have internal drives that drive us. Ashley?
I was going to say internal conflict.
Yeah, it's internal conflict. In this case, the conflict between the id and the ego before the superego comes to mediate the whole thing. You're following that? So we're still looking at conflict theories. So if you want to know why were these theories appealing, why were the theories of Marx appealing to the Freudians, and why were the theories of Freud appealing to the Marxists, it's because they are dealing with different kinds of conflict. But they're still dealing with conflict. Again, one is external conflict and the other is internal conflict. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. The Marxist Freudians are the folks who reformulated Freud's theory, but they were primarily psychoanalysts. They were trained in the Freudian tradition, and therefore they accepted most of what Freud had to say. What they tried to do is to incorporate Marxian concepts into what they were doing in psychoanalysis. But keep in mind, these folks are mainstream psychoanalysts who are simply adopting and incorporating parts of Marx. Another camp of the Freudian left are the Freudian Marxists. Quite the opposite. These folks are primarily what? Marxist, right? And they attempt, for example, here's an example of how they try to combine the theories. They try to explain the psychological dynamics of oppression in capitalist societies, psychological dynamics of oppression in societies, specifically capitalist societies. And what they were doing was taking Freudian concepts and looking at Marxist theory as their main base. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, can we see now how these theories grow and develop based on original writings of Freud, and they reformulate them in different ways, and because of that, sometimes they don't even look originally like Freudian theory. And we're going to take a look at Erikson's theory today. And most of us, we know that Erikson was a disciple of Freud, but most of us don't connect the main concepts to Erikson's stages of development. Any questions before we move to Erikson? Yeah?
I have a very broad question. Psychodynamic.
You have to use the mic.
Psychodynamic includes Freud and the others. What exactly is the definition of psychodynamic? Is it the unconscious?
Psychodynamic is what is going on internally inside the mind that includes the unconscious, yes. Absolutely.
So the theories that would be considered psychodynamic start with Freud and include...
The psychodynamic theories are essentially based some variation of Freudian theory. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, back over to Erikson. And we're going to be flipping back and forth. Let me tell you a little bit about Erikson as a child. Back over to me for a minute. If you remember, I told you in a previous lecture that when we're looking at a theory, we've got to look at several things. Who the person is writing the theory, what the influences are in his or her life, in this case mostly his. We'll find some female theorists coming up later, as we did last week. What is going on not only with their life, but also the broader society in which they live. And Freud, unfortunately, did not really tie his theory directly to a historical point in time, whereas Erikson did. In order to understand Erikson and his main concerns, it's important to understand a little bit about his childhood. He was born in 1902 in Germany to a Danish father and a Jewish mother. Father deserted the mother long before Erikson was even born. She eventually married a man who was then Erikson's pediatrician. He was also Jewish. So now we have this child who is half Danish, and by the way, not only half Danish, but looked Danish. Tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and half Jewish, growing up in a society in which he was ostracized for his looks. The other important thing is that he was never told early on the circumstances of his birth. Not surprisingly, we find him then searching for what? Identity. Does that make sense, Joel? Not surprisingly, because he struggled with his own identity throughout his life. It is not surprising that his main concern in his theory is how people achieve identity. Okay. Let's take a look first at the ways in which Erikson reformulated Freudian theory, and then we'll talk about the theory itself. To begin with, he retained Freudian concepts for his theoretical base. So the Freudian concepts are there. He's just changing them slightly, but the concepts are not being changed at this point. We know that his lifespan development did not stop in the teenage years, as did Freud's. So what he essentially did, and it's important to analyze it this way, is that he reformulated Freud's 5 stages, but he was still talking about the id, the ego, the superego. The id took less importance, as we will see. And that figures very prominently, not only in the first 5 stages that are very similar to Freud's in some of their assumptions, but also figures into the later stages. So he's now taking us through late adulthood. Very importantly, he minimized the importance of id drives. He didn't say they weren't there. He didn't say they didn't count for anything. He simply minimized them. And what he focused on was the healthy adaptive qualities of the ego. The healthy adaptive qualities of the ego. What's interesting about Erikson's theory is that in his very early writings, he really is very Freudian. In his later writings, he is less Freudian and really more concerned with the healthy adaptive ego. We will see he didn't get rid of the Oedipal complex. That's still there in his theory. However, he de-emphasized those drives and also desexualized the Oedipal complex. Let's think about this. Let's go back and analyze this. What did Freud say happens during the Oedipal complex? Child has to repress what?
Attraction to the parent of the...
Okay, not just attraction, but sexual attraction to the parent of the opposite sex. And therefore, in the rest of Freudian theory, essentially what's going to be happening is that everything else is based on the resolution of this Oedipal complex. That is not the case to the same extent with Erikson's theory. Get back to the PowerPoint. It's also a conflict theorist. Conflict is located in a different place, though. It's not between the ego and the id, but it's rather conflicts at each stage in life in which people experience a crisis of sorts between two opposing personality traits. Or you might think about them as basic attitudes or personality traits, but they eventually manifest themselves as personality traits. So here we still have a conflict theory. We still have conflict going on internally inside the person, but it's not between the id and the ego. It's between these various personality traits that they have to resolve. Of these conflicting traits, one is egosyntonic and the other is ego-dystonic. What does that mean? Anybody have any guesses? Yeah. Shakira. Are you using a microphone? No. Nobody will be able to hear you.
The systonic is the same, and it's congruent with what your ego wants to do, and dystonic is the exact opposite of, and it creates some type of conflict for you.
Okay, very, very right on. Something that is egosyntonic is pleasing to the ego. Something that is ego-dystonic is not. Now, what Erikson said, however, is that to get healthy resolution, you can't just lose one. What you have to resolve is the conflict between the two in such a way that it's balanced towards the ego-syntonic, but maintains some of the dystonic tendency. Again, it's a balancing that tilts it towards that trait that's ego-syntonic, but not getting rid of the ego-dystonic trait. Any questions about that? Yeah. Okay. Here's another key component of his theory, that the way in which infants, adults, resolve a crisis at each stage or at each stage of his theory, this leads to what he considers to be lasting ego qualities. In other words, we're formulating personality as well as ego qualities. And very importantly, he emphasized the ability to achieve mastery. Back over to me for a minute. Where did we talk about mastery last? We talked about mastery as being what? Primary Western value. Do you see how what I'm trying to get at is, do you see how our Western values get integrated into theories? The idea that we have to master stages. This is true in Freud's theory as well. The child has to master those conflicts between the id and the ego. In Erikson, it's between the syntonic and dystonic. But the notion is control and mastery. Okay, so let's take a look at stage 1. What Erikson's theory consists of are a variety of stages in which he talks about the two traits, the ego-syntonic, ego-dystonic, that present a conflict for the child. And he also talks about the expanding radius of relationships at each stage of development. So in stage 1, during trust versus mistrust, which we're going to be talking about, the radius of the relationship is mother. Back over to me. His theory, this is very importantly, as we start taking a look at these stages, his theory is based on the concept of epigenesis. And where does that come from? Anybody remember from your readings? When something is epigenetic,
From emergence.
You're close. It's taken from in utero development. His model, Erikson's model, starts with a basic assumption that the way in which a child develops in utero physiologically, unfolding of different sequences, prescribed sequences in which a child develops. If you take a look at in utero development, and have any of you ever seen pictures of the child growing in the womb? You can see that the progression is sequential, that certain things happen at certain stages. In other words, at a certain point, the brainstem is formed. At another point, the ears are formed. At some point, the child is able to hear, even in utero. At a certain point, the eyes, etc., etc. You all following that? The idea that there is a sequence of stages that must naturally progress one from the other. That's really important, because we're going to take a look at stage theory as it applies to personality development and see whether or not it really, really fits. But certainly, Erikson's theory was based on the idea that as we progress in personality, as we progress in lasting ego qualities, that there is, first of all, that there are stages. That you must complete stage 1 successfully before you get to stage 2. You must successfully complete 2 before you get to 3, etc., etc. And similar to Freud, what do you think happens if somebody doesn't successfully complete a stage and then goes on to the next?
Fixation or stagnation.
Yeah, what's going to happen is that they're not going to have a healthy personality because there is something left unresolved. Y'all following that? Okay, so we're talking about stages. They are sequential. 1 has to happen before 2. 2 has to happen before 3. 3 has to happen before 4. And also that they are invariant. In other words, you can't have stage 4 before stage 2. They do not vary. Not only do they have a sequence, but they do not vary in their sequence. Is that making sense to you? You've got to look at that as the underlying feature of these stage theories, because that's one of the aspects that has come to have a lot of criticism attached to it. Okay, so as we start with Erikson's stage 1, does anybody remember, have you read Erikson's stage 1? What is going on there? Does anybody remember? Yeah.
Trust versus...
I can't hear you.
Trust. The child is learning to trust the environment and the people around him.
Yeah. The basic qualities that the child has to balance is trust versus mistrust. Because the child is interacting with people, and who is the person at this time? Mom, who is doing most of the nurturing, right? Very importantly, this is something we don't think about a lot. Human infants are dependent on their mothers much, much, much longer than any other species. So therefore, we pay a lot of attention to childhood, and in particularly development to the point that the children can, for example, walk on their own, take initiative on their own. So therefore, because the child is dependent on mom, the child has to be receptive to what mom is offering. And what's going on here as the child develops a relationship with mom is the basic conflict between trusting and not trusting. If mom provides what Erikson considers to be a predictable environment, in other words, the child knows that it's going to get fed. The child knows that its needs are going to get met. According to Erikson, from this, a basic sense of trust is going to develop. And what this requires is sameness and continuity from the caretaker. And it also implies a capacity to cope with one's urges. Let's take a look at this. This is an important concept. Another thing that Erikson changed, by the way, he said, let's go back to Freud. Freud said if you get too much or too little need gratification, pathology is going to result, right? According to Erikson, it wasn't the quantity, but the quality. So it's not that mom is giving too much or giving too little, but the quality. Again, an enduring relationship that builds trust. And the ego quality that is gained from that is something that he called hope. Sounds reasonable, right? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. Back now to the PowerPoint for a minute, to stage 2. Stage 2 is very classic neo-Freudian. He's naming it something else. He's saying that the two qualities the child has to balance here is shame versus autonomy. Shame or doubt versus autonomy. The radius of the relationship now changes. Mom is still there, but now we also have dad. And back over to me. So let's go to his basic thesis. How does a child learn autonomy? It's through learning how to control what? Bodily functions. Bodily functions. Here we're talking about retention and elimination of urine and feces. That's what Freud was talking about, and guess what? That's exactly the same thing that Erikson was talking about. They gave it different qualities, though. Clearly, children before the age of 2, the average child, cannot do this. So we're depending not only on psychological development, but some degree of physical development to have control over your muscles. According to Erikson, the child simultaneously experiments with 2 different modes, holding on and letting go. According to Erikson, parents must be really firm, but also be tolerant so that the child can gradually learn through bladder control and bowel control a sense of self-control without losing self-esteem. You all following this so far? The idea that through learning how to control your bowel and your bladders, you are going to have a sense of self-control. Now, what is magic about the age roughly 2 that he puts to that? Back over to me. Oh, you're already at me. Okay. What is magic about the age of 2?
Well, 2-year-olds start to realize they have the ability to say no, and they have the ability to do their own thing.
Okay, what else is going on physiologically at age 2?
They can walk.
They can walk. You're starting to talk. So we have a lot of physiological development co-occurring with the ability to hold on or let go. What I'm trying to get at, what is magic? Why do we think that age 2 is so important in this society for children to be able to be potty trained? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
I think parents get tired of changing diapers after a while.
Well, that would happen in any society. Well, we have not always had diapers as we know them. But we've always had some form of diapers, I suppose. Yeah, Andrea.
Start sending them to daycare.
Okay, in today's society, here's where the child, particularly in our society, children at this point are interacting with other children, going to other people's homes. So it's not just about changing diapers. How are you going to let your child who is 2 years old in a pool with other kids if they cannot control their bowels? You following that? Mm-hmm. So a lot of these age limits, what I'm trying to suggest is that a lot of these age limits that we superimpose on these stages, and don't all of us believe that children must be potty trained by the age of 2? Yes? Mm-hmm. You're shaking your head no, Tony. What's up?
I just think it could take, 3, 4. I mean, I wouldn't see it as an issue until, and like if you're in kindergarten and you're still having troubles, I think maybe that's something that needs to be addressed. But before then, I don't see it that big of a deal.
Yeah, it's not. Individuals might not see it as that big of a deal, but society, in a sense, demands it. In industrial societies, think about this. Agricultural societies, we don't have kids going to school. In the same way, we don't have mandatory schooling. And therefore, the stages and ages of developmental tasks do not have to be so strict and rigid. Okay, back to Erikson's theory. This leads to the ability to have self-control, autonomy, pride, and it gives a lasting ego quality of what he considers to be willpower, which is the determination. What is willpower? Yeah.
Self-control.
Willpower is self-control, self-restraint, and also free choice. The idea that we can make free choices and that we can also use self-constraint. And here we're not just talking about potty training, we're talking about ego qualities that last throughout life. So if there's a problem at stage 2, what's going to happen? You're going to see pathologies in which people are either overly controlled as people or do not exhibit enough control. You all following that? It's important to remember that Freud and Erikson both, Erikson particularly in his early theories, was really looking to explain pathological behavior. They weren't looking to explain normalcy. We're going to come to that in a little bit. And I need a sip of water. Okay, over to the slide PowerPoint again. Stage 3, roughly ages 3 to 5 years old. Now the radius of relationships, it's not just mom and dad, according to Erikson, but the rest of the family. And we'll talk about the ego quality of purpose. Okay, in this stage, back over to me. Think about what's going on with a child of 3 to 5 years old. They're now not only walking, they're running, right? They're jumping, yes? How many of you have kids? What were they like at 3, 4, 5, physically? What are some of the things they do? Yeah.
Well, they're trying to be more independent. They're trying to be, away from the parents and mingling with the other little kids their age.
Okay, so we see kids trying to be more independent, mingling with other kids. Ashley?
A lot of them have imaginary friends, or they start creating games and just using their imagination a lot.
And in fact, even Erikson said, it's amazing what children can imagine. It's truly amazing what children can imagine. Okay, very importantly, it's their ability to walk and run that now gives them access to a wider radius of social relationships. They're no longer as dependent on mom and dad. The other thing that's going on is the language skills that allow children to be able to imagine so many things. Before you have the cognitive ability to have imagination, it's hard to know what is going on in the child's mind unless they can tell you. And since they don't start talking typically until age 2, the average child, here we're looking at increased imagination because they have increased concepts that they're learning through language. Very importantly, we're back to Oedipal wishes. We didn't get rid of them, we're just changing the nature of them. He agreed with Freud. He said that those edible urges towards the opposite sex parent have to be repressed in order to temporarily mask the initiative towards the opposite sex parent. Temporarily. Although it's going to be necessary to become attached to the opposite sex later in life, at this point, you don't want that initiative to be towards mom and dad. And therefore, in order to avoid guilt, because what is the stage about? Initiative versus guilt. In order to avoid guilt, you have to repress the Oedipal complex and begin to take one's own initiative. At this stage, parents are assisting children in learning appropriate sex roles. And let's go back to the ages. We're talking about ages 3 to 5. What did we say last week happens at age 5, more or less? 5 or 6? In Freudian theory, what develops at age 5 or 6? Is this over your heads? Freud had the id, the ego, and the superego. Let's take a look logically at children at the age of 5. Children at the age of 5 are now able to incorporate the norms of their mom and their dad and even society into their own consciousness, so that they are no longer guided by punishment and reward necessarily. They have their own, not at 3, but by 5, 6 years old, they have now internalized senses of right and wrong. So towards the end of the stage, very importantly, the conscience or the superego becomes established. So even though he's changing Freud's theory, he's still basing it on the idea that a superego is there. He's got the same stages and ages as Freud, that a superego becomes established to govern initiative. And with a strong superego, we have a healthy person. With a weak superego, what happens? People are left with constant conflicts because they cannot take that initiative. Okay, this initiative in later stages of life lead people to have purpose, lead people to have goals. And that's that lasting ego quality of purpose. Any questions thus far? Can you see how this really parallels Freud's theory? He's replaced the conflict away from the id, making it more of an ego conflict that the ego has to resolve. Conflict that the ego has to resolve, but he's still essentially talking about the id, the ego, the superego, conflicts within the child, and he is still very tied to Freudian concepts, but changing them in a way that makes it much more reasonable to accept. You all understand that? Because which of us, I mean, let's take a look at this logically. Which of us would want to think that we cannot take initiative? Isn't that part of our Western culture? And how many of us think that shame is a good thing? And therefore, we want to take initiative and we want to avoid shame, and therefore, this just seems to make a whole lot of sense, right? Okay, let's go to stage 4. Again, very Freudian-based stage of industry versus inferiority. Roughly, now take a look at how big this time span is compared to the others. Stage 1 was just about a year, stage 2 was about a year, stage 3 was a few years, and now we have an age span of 6 through 12. So this is a very lengthy stage. And this corresponds to Freud's 4th stage as well, his stage of latency. Okay, what's happening here in the real world is that the radius of relationships for children ages 6 through 12 really does expand. Back over to me. And we're looking at it expanding to school and the neighborhood. And here is where we see children really making their own friends as opposed to playing with kids that mommy and daddy take them to. Yes? Here's where kids start expanding their radius of the people who they interact with in their lives. At this point, we're back to mastery. The child is now in school. They're enmeshed in the world of schools and enmeshed in gaining new skills, not just knowledge, but skills and abilities. As children develop their abilities and the skills that they develop at school, they get a sense of mastery that they can be industrious. Is that making sense to you? So here we are back with the Oedipal drive repressed, but unlike Freud, the Oedipal drive doesn't come back up. It was simply important to be repressed right at that point. The Oedipal drive does not play much of a major role in the rest of this theory. It did in stage 3. But essentially, Erikson is saying very similar things to what Freud is saying, except that Freud was still very, very focused on that Oedipal complex that had to be repressed. In stage 4, children learn to do things, to make things, and this gives them a sense of accomplishment or industry. When children are not able to balance these traits, they end up feeling inferior, feeling inadequate. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Stage 5. Remember what we said at the beginning of this lecture? What is the most important stage here? Stage 5. And why is it important? Because this is what this theory is really about. It's about Erikson's own search for identity, and therefore this stage is the stage of utmost importance in the theory. The stage is identity, gaining a lasting ego identity versus having role confusion about who you are. Again, a fairly long stage. We're looking at ages 12 through 18. And you've got to remember that Erikson was writing in the 1940s and 50s, and let's make sure that we place him in that historical time period. The radius relationship are both peers and role models. Back over to me. And let's take a look at this. In the real world of childhood, what's going on at this stage? Peers are more important than anybody else. Peers play a major influence. It's not that parents aren't important, because they're still important in kids' lives. But peers take on a new significance as children start to individuate further and further away from mom and dad. What else is going on at puberty? Raging hormones, yes? Raging hormones. And therefore, what's happening is that there's a major disruption in physical development with the hormones, and it disrupts the continuity of childhood. Well, think about this. The continuity of childhood, we see people growing and progressing bit by bit, and now all of a sudden we have hormones that are now steering our libidinal urges and coming back to the surface. But this is no longer in the unconscious. These are very conscious things that are going on because of the changes. At this stage, and this was the most important stage for Erikson, the child, the adolescent, has to forge a lasting ego identity. The child has to align his or her basic drives, their endowments, and also their opportunities. So let's take a look at how each stage builds on the other. If a child does not have industry, does not gain industry, what happens next in this next stage? Then they're not going to have a healthy sense of identity. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. At this stage, what's really going on is the child, in a sense, is looking back at who he or she has been. Also, the ability now to look towards the future and integrating the two. Again, the past view of self and the emerging view of self and who the child wants to be in the future is something that really has to come to completion at this stage. And if it doesn't, then what emerges is an identity crisis. Very importantly in this stage, because we're also dealing with raging hormones and genital maturity, we're also talking about defining new and appropriate sex roles. And not surprisingly, in all of these formulations, there is only one really appropriate quote-unquote sex role, which is girls get interested in boys and boys get interested in girls. It does not account for any other kind of development. And to different extents, to various extents, and we'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks, both Freud and Erikson pathologized, but not terribly, but did pathologize homosexuality. because it was not seen as being quote-unquote normal. Okay, the other thing that's going on at this stage is that take a look at the kind of expectations that we have of teenagers. Do we give them conflicting demands? On the one hand, we're saying, act like an adult. And on the other hand, we're saying, you're still a child, you have to listen to me. So children have to take these conflicting demands from parents and from society, and the new expectations from their parents add to the stress of this stage. Very importantly, what Erikson thought was necessary at home was tolerance, understanding, and guidance from the parents. And typically, how do parents react to teenagers with raging hormones? Use the mic.
Lock them in their room.
Many of them want to lock them away until they hit maturity. Yeah, sometimes parents are not tolerant. Sometimes parents are not able to guide and understand, and some parents do. But what Erikson clearly said is that because teenagers are going through such stresses at this stage that are not just psychological but also physiological, that they must be met with tolerance and understanding in order for them to eventually get what he considered to be an integrated ego identity. I'm going to repeat that because we're going to come back and look at the whole notion of integrated ego identity in a future lecture. That's an important concept, folks, because most of these theorists keep telling us that we have to be integrated, that we have to have one core self. And the way in which we resolve this conflict at this stage leads us to have that one core self and a lasting ego identity. If people do not achieve this, they are left with very strong doubts about who they are. Now, does that describe Erikson? There he was. I mean, this really describes his life. Not knowing who his biological father was, not looking like the other children, not being accepted, and really struggling with ego identity. Very importantly, the ego quality this leads to is that of fidelity. And in this case, it's not fidelity to another person, but it's fidelity to self. Does that make sense? It's the ability to have it's hard to say, freely pledged loyalties. But here we're talking about fidelity. It's going to take a different turn in the next stage, but at this point, it's fidelity to self, of self. Any questions about that? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Stage 6. Now here's where Erikson departed from Freud and is now building later life stages. But remember, he's not the first one to do this. So the idea that we grow and develop throughout life is not necessarily original with him, but this is the theory that has really caught on and has steered much of the research and scholarship. In this stage, roughly the early to late 20s, the main task is balancing intimacy versus isolation. The radius expands, and now it's no longer just mom, just dad, just family. Back over to me. Or peers, because peers were very important and role models in the last. Now it has to do very specifically with partners. Friends are still there, but now this is the stage at which, and you've got to remember the time frame in which he was writing. In the 1950s, we didn't have birth control other than condoms. So the fact that most women gave birth fairly early on, got married fairly early on, did not have control over their own reproduction, led to a certain kind of family structure that we talked about before. It led to a certain developmental task that we expected people to achieve in their 20s. And many, back then and even now, many people do have children in their 20s. Unfortunately, many of them have them much, much younger now, which is not as acceptable. The task here is not about childbearing. The task here is literally about becoming intimate with another person. Becoming intimate with another person. Childhood and youth are over. And now this child, what was a child, is now thrust into the adult world. It's time now for them to choose a career. Time to socialize with the opposite sex, but not have sex until they're married, but socialize with the opposite sex, And what's important in this stage is being able to bond to another person, very specifically opposite sex person, to gain a lasting sense of intimacy with that person. Intimacy in Erikson's theory included not just emotional or psychological intimacy, but also sexual intimacy. So therefore, this is something that is leading to marriage. If people are not able to bond at this stage and become intimate, deeply intimate with another person, what he said is that they tend to become totally self-absorbed. Self-absorbed. So therefore, the notion of isolation. Think about the isolate who doesn't care about other people, doesn't need other people, and is absorbed in self. The proper resolution of this stage leads to a lasting ego quality of, I just love this, love. And we'll see how he also changed his theory and incorporated this into his later theories as well. Okay, on to the next stage. Roughly late 20s to 50s, he's talking about generativity versus stagnation. That leads to the ego quality of care. And back over to me. This is the stage now. We're talking about 20s to 50s. That's a very big stage, yes? Bigger than the other stages, yes? Much longer. We're talking about mature genitality in the Freudian sense. Truly. Here is where mature genitality leads to procreation, leads to having kids. And it leads not only to having the children, but establishing guidance for this next generation. Now, not everybody, clearly not everybody can do this. And therefore, according to Erikson, what they had to do was sublimate. That's one of the ego defenses. Sublimate means you take these urges, and in this case, it's the natural tendency to want and have children, and if you can't for whatever reason or don't, you sublimate these urges into altruistic activities. Simply wanting to have children or having children is not enough to complete the stage, however. To complete the stage, you have to take an active role in making things better for generations to follow, guiding the next generation. So it's not just about having children, it's about looking towards the future, not just for you, but for the generations to follow. And when people don't do that, they stagnate. They become self-indulgent. Do you see how self-absorption, if you don't reach intimacy in the previous stage, and you become self-absorbed, what happens in the next stage? You stagnate as a self. The ego quality of care that results from this is essentially about concern for others. Concern for others. Any questions about that as we get to his last stage? Finally, his last stage in later adulthood. Back to the PowerPoint for a minute. After age 50. After age 50. And you have to put this in historical context, that as we become a society that is living longer, 50 in his day is not the same as 50 today. People did not live as long, and it's our technology that has helped prolong life, helped stamp out diseases, help people live despite diseases. So when we say after age 50, here we're essentially talking about old age, and it's very hard for me, who is well over 50, to think about 50 as being old age. Okay, the radius of relationship now is no longer just people that you know, but humankind. And back over to me. Essentially, at this stage, what Erikson says is that we're looking towards the end of our life. That's really scary to think about as being just any place over 50. But we're looking, what we have to do at this stage, and it's a very long stage through death, what we have to do is look back at our past lives and feel comfortable with who we are and what we've done. We also have to combine that with a reality that we're not always going to be here. And we have to integrate those two. Does that make sense? Where do we see that integration of past and future before? In adolescence. And now at the end of life. In other words, we have to be able to face death without fear, without hesitancy about who we are and what we've done. In this stage, we take responsibility for our past choices, and we find meaning and contentment in what we have done, the road that we have traveled. And through this, according to him, a sense of integrity is achieved. If we can't do that, we become despairing old people. And the ego quality that evolves from this is that of, I love this one too, wisdom. Because we can always imagine the old wise person. And that's a trait that we used to attribute to older people. That's a trait that we used to attribute to older people. And most of us say, well, young people aren't wise. You have to have years of experience to become wise. Any questions about how he changed Freud's theory and how much more palatable it is? Can you understand how this not only took hold, but still has a strong grip on how we view human development? Any questions? Back to the PowerPoint for a minute. Very importantly, Erikson took the concept, he tied that concept of ego development very specifically to a historical, economic, and cultural phenomena. He said really clearly, by the way, that his theory was meant only to apply to industrialized societies. He never meant this to apply to any other kinds of societies. He was very aware of the historical limitations. He was very aware of the environmental demands, so to speak, the environmental demands that steer these modes of development. Very interestingly, he conducted cross-cultural research. However, probably inadvertently, I don't think this was deliberate, in his research, it often reflected deficiency formulations not only of women, but also of cultural minorities. Because he was coming at this from a totally Western perspective. And if he came and he studied Native Americans, and he was trying to explain why they were deficient in so many ways. If you go back, I mean, at first it looks like, unless you're aware of Western values, it looks like, boy, this is an accurate description. And then you see how much of his writing was really imbued with Western values. Okay, very importantly, back to PowerPoint, Erikson was one of the very few developmental theorists at that time who looked at religious development. And you can read more about that in your textbook. Very significantly for social work, what he described as the ideal of religious development, one of the things is that it propels people to work for societal welfare and to act against social injustice. And that's really important for us in the field of social work. And that's what he saw as being the pinnacle or ideal. Very importantly, another thing that Erikson did is that in his later work, he expanded on his earlier theories. Now, assuming that his earlier theory is correct, that could be a good thing, yes? But what happens if his earlier theory was not correct? What I'm trying to get at, back over to me for a minute, is that people become entrenched in their theories. We saw this in Freud, and people's thinking changes over time as they're developing theories, but the basic concepts that they start with are some of the concepts that are so deeply entrenched that even as they revise their own theories, they are still entrenched in their basic concepts. You all following that? So therefore, it's not surprising, and many theorists who live long lives and theorize for many years go back and look at their earlier work, and they say, this is still valid, and I got this point wrong, and let me change this point. We talked last week about Freud's seduction theory, right? How at one point he believed that children were actually being sexually molested by parents and others, and another point he believed it was a fantasy in the unconscious. In a similar way, Erikson has gone back, and he started with very pathological formulations, because all of these formulations were not only to talk about what was healthy, what was normal, but the converse, what was not normal. And very similar to Freud, what he's focusing on is what causes various kinds of neuroses, and back then they were called psychoses. They were looking for what causes abnormality. And that's why if you don't resolve a stage correctly, that was then their explanation about why this psychopathology emerged. Does that make sense? What you'll see with different theorists, remember the first class, I put my little fanny pack up here, and I had different students walk around it and say, what do you see? The concepts that you use are the ones that you superimpose on the phenomenon that you're observing. Does that make sense? And earlier I talked about it in terms of different disciplines, but different theoreticians. If you believe, as Freud did, in the ego and the superego as being the primary structures, and the conflict between that, that's how you're going to build and grow your theory. If, on the other hand, somebody like Erikson said, no, there's a conflict-free ego sphere and we need to concentrate on the ego, that is going to steer the rest of his theory. Back to the PowerPoint. What he did in his later work is that he further delineated what happens in ego identity as you get older. Not surprisingly, like many theorists, as they approach older age, guess what kind of development they get concerned about? Everybody, older age, yes? They get concerned about older age because even Erikson said that when he was a young man writing, he could not even picture himself as an old person. But as he became older, he became very interested in what happens in terms of personality development as people grow and as people develop. Does that make sense to y'all? Not surprisingly, he picked up on two of Freud's main, back to the PowerPoint for a second, two of Freud's main themes, love and work. Love and work. Freud, when asked what people should be able to do well, I'm going to butcher this because I can't speak German, answered Leben und Arbeiten, or Beten, meaning love and work. So Freud was focused on love and work, and guess who else was? Erikson, okay? And what he did is that he described parallels between earlier stages of development and later development. So in other words, he is somewhat entrenched in his work. He's revising it, though, and he's saying, okay, here's what I thought about when I was in my earlier years, in my 20s and 30s, and theorizing. And now, as I'm getting older, I'm coming up with different ideas about what happens in later life. And in collaboration with his wife, Joan Erikson, he looked back at his stages. Again, he wasn't dismissing his stages. His stages are still there. They're still important. But he's saying, okay, how do these manifest themselves as you become older? Stage one, remember what stage one was, everybody? Trust versus mistrust. Becomes appreciation of human interdependence. It's no longer just about trusting, but really appreciating how interdependent we are on each other. And take a look at how that makes sense in old age. As people begin to get older and frailer and need other people more, you have to really be able to appreciate the fact that you cannot be alone. Stage two, we're talking about control over one's body, initiative versus guilt. Guess what? In old age, we have concerns about, he calls it a mirror image. Because we can't control ourselves necessarily as young infants, and what happens as we get older to many people? We also have to be concerned with losing control, literally, of bodily functions. Here's the important point here, is that he was very focused on physical deterioration. Very focused on physical deterioration, and you're going to see how this manifests in many late life theories. He believed that we simply had to accept the fact that this is going to happen. Of course, today we have all kinds of medications that can keep urinary incontinence from happening. Okay, stage three. Remember, we're still talking about the Oedipal complex. What he says is that what that leads to is empathy and resilience and really having a sense of humor in old age. He said, I can't imagine a healthy older person who cannot laugh and smile. In stage four, it leads to a sense of effectiveness. Remember, we're talking about industry. And also a sense of humility. Because what happens as we get older? We have to have humility about the things that we can and cannot do, as we start to lose some of our abilities. So therefore, we have to be able to appreciate not just our competencies, but also our limitations. Stage 5 leads to an appreciation of how complex life is. And he was talking specifically about sensory and aesthetic perception. Stage 6, we're back to intimacy, right? We're concerned about a long-term bond, long-term intimate bond. Very importantly, over to me for a minute, Erikson's theory was a mirror image of his life. He married one woman and stayed married his entire life, and therefore much of his theorizing about intimacy has to do with what was seen as being normal. Does that make sense, y'all? We also have to remember, in the 1950s, divorce was almost impossible to get. It was expensive, it was very hard. There was no such thing as, we mutually agreed to just divorce. You had to dig up dirt or create dirt on the other person, and you had to have good reasons for divorce. So therefore, it was not uncommon to see people staying together for long periods of time. The minute we institutionalize divorce as being okay, we see things changing. Stage 7, he said, has two faces in old age, having a sense of caring for each other, and also really having empathy. And finally, in stage 8, it depends on the resolution of earlier stages. If you haven't resolved the earlier stages, you are not going to have the sense of completeness and wholeness that he says is necessary to pull us through the fact that we are physically disintegrating. It's that downward pull, because what's happening as we're getting older? We're losing some of our abilities. Okay, very importantly, a critique of Erikson. And we're going to go to a feminist critique as well. There's a lot of research on Erikson that say that they support his theories. However, one of the problems is that we don't have any agreed upon measures. Think about how difficult this is to measure. Can you measure ego? Can you measure identity? To some extent, but can you measure a healthy ego identity? We have to see it manifested in people's actions by their being, quote unquote, normal, right? We already talked about this earlier. His stages imply rigidity. Stage 1 has to happen first. Stage 2, they cannot be invariant. One of the biggest critiques, however, is that it really is a male model of development. Carol Gilligan, who we're going to be talking about later in the class, was writing an answer to Freud. And he said, if you take a look, writing an answer to Freud and Erikson, but she said specifically about Erikson, if you take a look at what they're saying, women are seen as being developmentally deficient. Now let's stop and analyze that for a second. Erikson's theory seems so logical, yes? Yes or no? They can't hear you without microphones.
Yes.
It seems so logical. It seems so intuitive. These are all stages that we want to attain. These are all ego qualities that we want to have because these are seen as positive and normal. Back to the slide. However, what Gilligan pointed out is that ego identity is equated with autonomy and individuation. Now, why is that a problem for women? Unlike men who become autonomous in adolescence, women don't quite meet that criteria because they cannot become whole until they find a mate and get married. They need a mate to fill that inner space. And therefore, for men, what she said is that identity comes first and then intimacy comes. Isn't that what his model says? Ego identity in adolescence, intimacy in your 20s. However, for women, these tasks seem to be fused. They cannot become whole because what is their main role? As wives and mothers. And without having marriage and children, they're not going to be whole people. Another thing that she pointed out is some of the inconsistencies in Erikson's theory. She said, he thinks that intimacy is so important, but however, if you look at his stages, there is only one stage that prepares you for intimacy. And that's that first stage of trust. Well, think about this. What happens in every other stage? We individuate away from people. Until when? Our early 20s. So what she's saying is that if every other stage involves separation and individuation, development itself becomes identified with separation. And therefore attachments, strong attachments, are seen as developmental impediments in earlier years. So you're not allowed to have strong attachments until you're really in your 20s. Any questions about that? None? Everything clear? Okay. Stage theories. Let's take a look at a general critique of stage theories. They're intuitive, aren't they? Do they seem to make sense to us? They're popular. It's been argued that they're popular because they're very much like horoscopes. Think about this. They are very vague, sufficiently vague, that all of us can see some aspects of ourselves in them. However, it is really important for us to remember that all because something is popular doesn't mean it's valid. All because something is popular doesn't mean that it's real, that it's valid. Very importantly, all of the stage theories incorporate in some degree or another the concept of normality. In other words, we're trying to describe normal development so that we can also describe pathological development, right? Folks, normality is a value-based concept. It is different. It depends on social, cultural, political, and historical contexts. What is normal at one historical point of time might be totally abnormal at another. What is normal in one social context might be totally pathological in another. Same is true for politically and culturally. And yet, all of these theories depend on this concept of normalcy, or normality. So, what do we mean by normality? Back over to me for a second. When we say that somebody is normal, what do we mean?
Fits in with the rest. Is
similar to other people? Other ideas? Yeah.
Similar to the Western culture?
Well, certainly these theories are Western and they're imbued with Western values. But what do we mean by normal within Western culture? Things that adopt, people that adopt Western, you're saying people that adopt Western ideas of expected actions, right?
Yes.
What else could we mean when we talk about people being normal? What does it mean to you? Yeah, Anna.
Can it be that those who conform to the established rules?
Absolutely. That's one definition of normality. If you think of somebody as being normal, what does it mean to you? Now, I really want us to explore this because this is imbued in all the theories. Yeah.
Kind of more like me.
They're like me because we have similar kinds of things. We believe similar things. What does normal mean to you? Yeah, Neftali.
It's not crazy. It doesn't have like very extreme mental moods. So, that is not very...
Okay, that there's some kind of consistency, that they are not mentally ill. So let's take a look at 3 definitions of normality. First of all, we haven't talked a statistical average. And any time you're doing research on populations, what are we looking for? Statistical averages, right? And the minute that we have statistics to back it up, it implies that it's a widespread condition. Another meaning of normality is, as you pointed out, Neftali, a mental health ideal. Ways in which people are mentally healthy as opposed to pathological. Ways in which people are mentally and emotionally consistent. Because what do we say when we see inconsistency in people? That there's something wrong with them. They're abnormal. Third definition is, as all of you, the rest of you have talked about, conventional behavior. Normality also means conventional behavior. However, conventional behavior is always based on current community and cultural standards. Very importantly, and this is why I'm focusing on normality, very importantly, When a theory of normality is established and put into stages, and what has Freud done? What has Erikson done? They've talked about normality in these various stages. What happens is that the descriptions of these stages then become a prescription for the desirable behavior. So we're not only describing stages, but we're saying how people should act, how people should resolve conflicts. Y'all following this? What is really important for us to remember, particularly as social workers, is that all theories have both social implications and political implications. So that it's not just a neutral exercise in theorizing, but the way in which we treat people, who we decide to hospitalize for a mental illness, who we decide to refer to juvenile authorities. The actions that we take are based on what we see as being normal for people. And you've got to remember that this varies very greatly from society to society, culture to culture, economic time to economic time. I mean, much of what we see in Erikson's theory really is based on a model that was prevalent in the 1950s, where people essentially grew up within a nuclear family by and large. What happens next? They go to school, they fall in love, they get married, they have children, and stay with the same life partner for the rest of their lives. Well, is that what happens today typically? No, and we're going to be talking more about that. Going back to the fact that we have social and political implications, once these behaviors are theoretically prescribed, they're not only a theory, but they're upheld by the educational system. What happens in schools when people see children acting in ways that they think are not normal? They get sent for mental health counseling, yes? They get sent for services. It's upheld by the religious system that tells us how people should act, what morality is. Upheld certainly by the legal system, because we have laws against certain behaviors, and certainly upheld by the psychotherapeutic system, which in a sense has an invested interest in finding more and more abnormalities so they can treat it. Does that make sense, Joe? Okay. Stemming from the work of Erikson and Freud, we have a variety of theorists who are writing about people at midlife. Okay, as these younger theorists get older and they get into the middle part of their lives, guess what they're interested in? Doesn't this make sense? When you're younger, you're mostly interested in early stages and you can project into later life. When you become middle-aged or nearing middle age, you start getting concerned about what happens to people at midlife. And theorists named there Levinson, Vaillant, Gould, Farrell, and Rosenberg. These are all studies of typically men at midlife. And not surprisingly, many of the early theories postulated that people undergo something called a midlife crisis. Midlife crisis. Back over to me in the class for a minute. When we think about people having a midlife crisis, how does that manifest itself? How does it show itself?
Buying a sports car and running off with the secretary.
Yeah, for a man, buying a sports car and running off with his secretary and leaving his wife. Yeah. Ashley.
Or maybe even quitting a profession that they've been doing for so long and maybe doing something for a hobby, like quitting a oil company and becoming a professional fisherman.
Okay, people will make drastic changes at midlife. Drastic changes at midlife. What else? What are some of the other indications? Yeah, Andrea.
Start dyeing their hair and trying to maintain a youthful appearance.
That can be seen as a crisis, and nowadays I think it's seen as a normal expectation. Well, and you've got to, again, we cannot ignore the way in which society, not just the individual, because remember, these are all intrapsychic and interpersonal theories. They pay attention to the environment to some extent. But some of the advances that we have today, plastic surgery used to be relatively rare. We didn't have things like Botox, Restylane, the kind of cosmetic fillers. We've had hair dyes, but now we have many hair dyes. And it is certainly seen as more, let's go back to normalcy. It is seen as more quote-unquote normal today for people to do that. And in fact, I think the norms have shifted when it comes to that. When people don't do that, what's wrong with you? Yes? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Very importantly, even though the early research found midlife crisis, more recent research has found, quite honestly, midlife is pretty mundane for most people. And that there are relatively few men or women really experience a true crisis. And here we're talking about psychological crisis. You know, following that, we're not talking about, for example, economic crises that we have no control over. But we're talking about personality crises. And what the research says is that this is not common. And for some people, it's not a crisis, it's a point of growth. It's a point of growth rather than being a crisis. There are other researchers and theorists that absolutely refute the idea of midlife theories. Some of these, Alice Rossi, for example, one of the concepts that she gives us that's really important is that, folks, we want to talk about gender neutrality, but you can't ignore biology. Yes, that doesn't mean that women and men cannot do the same things and accomplish the same things, but she tries to remind us that there really are biological differences between people, and let's not ignore that when we talk about what normalcy is. Nancy Schlossberg says, wait a minute. Back over to me now. She says, wait a minute. These stages no longer exist. These stages are blurred. Let's go back to Erikson's basis formulation. Childhood, we're in school. Yes? What happens after childhood? Adolescence. We're supposed to suppress those sexual urges. What is happening more and more with teenagers? They are not suppressing them. Being an unwed mother, teenage mother, used to have great stigma attached to it. While it certainly has economic consequences for people, it no longer has that stigma. And therefore, when people have children, and whether or not they're married and in an intimate relationship really has changed. In his model, you don't get married until you're in your 20s and have children right about then. What's happening now, folks? Do people always get married in their 20s and stay with the same partner? What do we see instead?
Blended families. Blended families.
Okay, we see marriage, divorce. And by the way, most people who get divorced, the majority get remarried. And therefore we see blended families, so it's no longer this nuclear family structure. Your intimacy is no longer with that one person you married the first time necessarily, although that's still a model. We're not saying it doesn't happen. It's just that it's certainly not as common. So we see blended families. We see people in their 20s and 30s doing other things than what was expected in Erikson's generation. For example, please pan to the students in the room for a second. If you take a look at us and our various ages, who would have predicted that people would be back in school in their 30s and 40s and 50s? So what Schlossberg is saying, back to me now, what she is saying is that there's no necessary sequence of these stages, that these stages are all intermixed, and some of these developmental tasks that define normalcy do not happen in a sequential fashion, that we cannot ignore the role that society plays and social changes, technological changes, as well as social changes. We've had massive shifts in society, massive shifts in society that just make times different. Now, importantly, remember, Erikson was real clear that he was talking about only his time period, right? And he was only talking about industrial societies. However, his prediction would be that any industrial society would develop in the same manner and that people would go through the same developmental tasks. And when you look at other industrialized societies, that might not be as true. It might not be as true, and we're going to be taking a look at that as we work on our midterm projects. Albert Bandura points out to us that much of what happens to us is luck, pure chance. Well, think about this. We happen to be lucky to be in the right place at the right time and meet somebody who then steers our life in a certain direction. Or we happen to miss an opportunity that has nothing to do with us and our inability. And he says, to talk about these developmental stages does not make sense. In fact, some of the earlier theorists who were writing about stage theories now say that they're hogwash. We have some research on midlife gender development. And essentially what these theorists are saying is that development may differ for women than it does for men, not only in earlier years, but in midlife. And that has to do with society, again, going back to societal expectations of finding a mate. We still stigmatize people who are single. We still stigmatize people who are not married or who have never married. And therefore, we want people to find mates, and particularly women. For women, this is much more true. Because we still tend to think of women who are not married as old maids, whereas men who are not married are simply bachelors. The other thing that we find in women at midlife is that they have an increased need for autonomy, an increased desire to be more autonomous. Because of our societally prescribed roles that they be wives and mothers, now is the first time that they really can gain their own autonomy. And three of the paths that have been defined for women now, today in contemporary society, is some women are simply homemakers. Not when I say simply, they are simply homemakers and mothers. Others are simply career women. Do you see how I'm not negating any of these? Others, however, are simply a combination of both. So unlike men, who are expected to go out and have a career, women have different kinds of societal expectations and constraints that might lead where they go in midlife. Importantly, if you take a look at development in late adulthood, most of these theories are based on variations of of Erikson's stages and tasks. Very importantly, most of them emphasize, guess what? Physical deterioration. You've got to remember, in his later life, as Erikson was older, he was facing physical deterioration, and therefore that really became the focus of his theory. So most of the old age theories emphasize physical deterioration, as well as changing expectations on the elderly, as well as declining abilities. However, feminist Betty Friedan did a lot of research on aging, as she was an older woman. And what she says is that our concept of old age is simply based on myths. Age, in most of these theories, is seen as a pathological state, not a normal state, but something that is filled with deteriorating capabilities. And she said, we tend to equate age with illness, not normalcy, but illness. What she proposes is that if we look at simple things, changes in diet, exercise, changes in environment, those are things that can actually modify or reverse much of our decline. When we leave people role-less and want them to simply retire into obscurity, playing shuffleboard, for example, we should not be surprised that we see people declining mentally. And she's saying that if we change some of the conditions around people and get them to do different things, some of these things can be changed. The other thing that she rails about is what you were talking about before, was it actually the youthful definitions. We tend in our society to define youth as the pinnacle of health. And we simply cannot continue those youthful definitions into older life, that we've got to take a look at the reality of what older life is like. And what she concluded is that most older people, in fact, can be vital, unless they're in ill health. Because remember, we have essentially two groups of elderly. We have the elderly that are ill and the elderly that are not ill. For the elderly that do not have physical constraints that they can't get past, she says many older people can continue to grow, certainly emotionally and psychologically. Even if you have physical disabilities, you can still grow emotionally and be vital. That it doesn't have to be a steady period of decline. Any questions before we go to the summary? I've been that clear? No questions at all? We still have 3 minutes. Okay, let's go to the summary then. If we take a look at the research, and the research is in your textbook, on midlife and older life development, even on Ericksonian development, the research is really contradictory. And in fact, there's very little consensus among the various theorists. One of the things that I think we can conclude from this is that despite the idea that these theories are based on universal principles, there probably aren't any. Does that make sense to y'all? These are theories are based on universal principles about what is normal, what is pathological, and those universal principles probably do not exist. If you take a look at studies, some of the studies support stepwise or stage development, while other studies do not support it. So the research really is contradictory. Here's the key, folks. If you're looking for stages, you will find stages. Does that make sense? Remember what I told you earlier about how the mindset of the theorist steers their theory? If you believe that there are stages, you're going to go in and do research looking for stages and defining stages. If you don't believe that there are stages, you're going to have different kinds of research questions and you're going to focus your research elsewhere. Very importantly, and I'm going to close with this, back over to me. We tend to like stage theories because we find them appealing. Again, they're like horoscopes. We can see ourselves in them. Who does not want to be intimate? Who does not want to have a healthy ego? Are you all following that? So therefore, let's go back to the idea that they're appealing, but let's not confuse a theory's appeal with its validity. Let's not confuse its popularity with its validity. Any questions? Okay, that's it for today. We'll see you next time.